Hello, this is Nick from Breaker Press Games, and in this episode of DCC Basics, we are going to talk about Other Combat Rules Part 3. Alright, so this is the third and final part of the Other Combat Rules sub-series of DCC Basics. In Part 1, we covered, a bunch of stuff. You can check it out over here. And then in Part 2, we covered even more stuff, which you can check out over here. This particular episode, we are going to cover grappling, subdual damage, and unarmed combat. Before we get into the thick of it, if you would like to support Breaker Press Games further, you can check out on Kickstarter right now is Horrors of the Whispering Wood, which is a box set. That is a hex crawl toolkit and a bestiary based around the Whispering Wood. This is a DCC compatible product that is also built around a region outside of Stennard, my campaign setting. Additionally, you can become a member on Patreon. In fact, perfectly timed with this particular episode, currently shipping is the Bruiser 2.0, your unarmed combat specialist. So if you think that sounds pretty cool, go and become a member on Patreon. At $6 and above, you get cool stuff mailed to your house every month. And the next reward is going to be the GOAT class that Reverend Dak is finishing up the editing on right now. All right, so let's get into it and talk about unarmed combat stuffs. So first and foremost, let's cover grappling. And grappling, each party makes an opposed attack roll, adding the higher of their agility or strength modifier, or in the case of monsters, they add their hit dice. So if it was a 6 hit dice monster, they're going to add +6 to their grappling attack roll, which is pretty fantastic. Grappling a monster is not necessarily the wisest idea. That doesn't mean that my players don't try it all the time. I got somebody that's obsessed with trying to ride different monsters that they encounter, but that's a whole other story. So, an attacker twice the size of the opponent's size adds +4, and as the size difference escalates to 3 times or 4 times the size, it can be as much as +8 or +16. So if a giant was trying to grapple a halfling, they would get +16 to their roll, for example. So, keep that in mind. If the attacker wins the opposed roll, they have grappled and pinned their opponent. Otherwise, the grapple fails. So, just imagine, the classic trope of like the giant holding up the tiny person and they are flailing about. Just kind of picture that. So, a pinned target cannot move or take significant action until freed. This is done by succeeding in another grapple check. So every time the grappled opponent's initiative comes up, they're going to make another check as long as they are still pinned by their opponent. They are still grappled. So, that being said, melee attacks against a grappled creature are treated similarly to fire into missile combat. Wait, let me restate that. Melee attacks against a grappled creature are treated similarly to firing a missile into melee. A failed melee attack against a grappled creature has a 50% chance of wounding the ally, maintaining the pin. So, if you can picture, somebody is, let's say, in a full Nelson and they are being held, being pinned, and they are struggling and flailing about, and somebody else comes up to try and shank the person that is grappled. If they miss, they have a good chance of stabbing their ally. So keep that in mind. Having somebody grappled is not a surefire way to assure that you have them under control. So, moving on. Let's talk about subdual damage. So subdual damage, you can use the flat of your sword to subdue an opponent you wish to capture alive. This is something that is super useful. You know, one of the first things that people do in combat is they treat everything like a lethal combat, but sometimes you're going to want to capture somebody alive. Additionally, you know, bandits or poachers or whatever, they may want to capture the PCs alive, or guards, the town guards. So this is a rule that is really useful. If you are proficient in swords, axes, clubs, spears, or staves, you can inflict subdual damage. There is no attack penalty, but subdual damage is one lower than the normal weapon damage. So if you're trying to subdue somebody with the flat of a longsword, it is going to do D7 damage instead of D8 damage. Or if you're trying to hit them with the what's a weapon that does D6? A hand axe. If you're trying to hit them with the back end of a hand axe in order to try and knock them out, it is going to do D5 damage instead of D6 damage. So keep all of that in mind. An opponent that is brought to 0 HP via subdual damage is rendered unconscious. So that is the whole point of subdual damage, is the attempt to try and knock somebody out. Now, one of the things that is not specified in this is that lethal damage and subdual damage, if somebody had, the way I play it is that if somebody has sustained a bunch of lethal damage and then their subdual damage would render them unconscious, if you added them together, then I would treat it as such. Additionally, if somebody has sustained no lethal damage and they take take a bunch of subdual damage, but it is not enough to render them unconscious, and then they took some lethal damage, I would also treat that as, I would combine them together, and the lethal damage would knock them unconscious if there was a bunch of subdual damage that was getting them to that point. That, of course, is not specified in the nature of DCC. Sometimes things are a little ambiguous, but you know, keep that in mind, that they are not two completely separate pools, or at least that is not explicitly stated. Finally, unarmed combat. Unarmed combat inflicts subdual damage of 1d3 plus your strength modifier. Now, this is a rule that I would personally contest, because obviously people in the real world get beaten to death all the time. It's a horrible thing. It exists. It is a real possibility. So I allow both monsters and PCs, if they are using unarmed combat, if let's say you're being beaten up by the guards, I might choose to specifically use subdual damage, or I might specifically choose to use lethal damage. The vice versa also applies. If somebody was engaging in unarmed combat, perhaps the bruiser was engaging in unarmed combat, they can make the choice between whether they are inflicting lethal damage or they are inflicting subdual damage. So I think that covers all that you need to know about grappling, subdual damage, and unarmed combat. I think that these add a lot of option and excitement to your games of DCC RPG. And I hope that you all, both as judges and players, flex these regularly. With that being said, thank you for supporting indie games and indie game designers. Appreciate you watching another episode of DCC Basics, and keep an eye out for more stuff in the future. In fact, watch this video that I have listed over here right now.